politics, or is it doing more to damage world relations?
Do you want to read it, or?
No, he said it.
Oh, he's read it.
Should we
Yeah,
do
I'm sorry, I can't hear that well. Yeah, all I hear is noise. But I think it's WikiLeaks. It's very beneficial. I mean, power systems in general don't want people to know what they're up to for pretty obvious reason. But people ought to want to know what power systems are up to. WikiLeaks does not give deep revelations. It's not like declassified documents. So it's not like the Pentagon Papers, for example, or just the documents that can come out in ordinary declassification, which deal with planning. And they give really, in a way, deep insights into how planning is executed. This gives shallow insights into what diplomats perceive, or in fact claim that they perceive, because there's a point that you ought to keep in mind that was actually made by Craig Murray, many of you know, who was the former British ambassador who was cashiered because he was ambassador to Uzbekistan, and he was reporting back to the Foreign Office about the hideous atrocities carried out by one of their favorite mass murderers, Karimov, in Uzbekistan. They didn't like that, so he was kicked out of the diplomatic service. But he pointed out, and he's right, that what diplomats tend to report back home is what they think the bosses want to hear. And that's how your career advances. You tell them what they don't want to hear, you're going to be in trouble. So there is a kind of a filter that you have to think about when you read the WikiLeaks exposures. It may not be what the facts are. It's the way it's either perceived or interpreted or reshaped by the diplomat who's sending it back. Nevertheless, they're revealing, and they tell us a lot. And they help, in fact, they tell us things related to what we've just been talking about. So some of the most shocking revelations in WikiLeaks, I don't know how it's been reported here, have to do with Pakistan. Pakistan is the most dangerous country in the world. There's a combination of two tendencies in Pakistan which have been developing since the 1980s. Incidentally, as part of Ronald Reagan's legacy to the world. In the 1980s, they had the worst of the horrible series of dictators that they've had, all of them backed by the US and Britain. But the worst of them was in the 80s. That was Zia-ul-Haq. He was carrying out two major policies. One of them was a policy of radical Islamization. With Saudi Arabian funding, he was setting up a network of ultra-religious schools and madrasas where you don't learn anything but the Quran, training for jihad and so on. And Ronald Reagan was patting him on the head. He said, that's fine. The other was developing nuclear weapons, which the US government, I suppose the British government, pretended they didn't know, although of course they knew. So now what you have is a state which has the most rapidly developing nuclear arsenal in the world, quite large, a state which could break up. It's kind of like a patchwork, barely held together. The only stable institution by now is the army. There's also a big radical Islamist element. You've probably, a couple of months ago, you may remember an official was assassinated after he criticized the uses of the blasphemy law. And there were huge demonstrations in support of the assassins. And among the demonstrators were these black-suited young lawyers who were praising the assassin. And they're the ones who are the reformers. They're the ones who demonstrated to overthrow the Musharraf dictatorship and bring about reforms. But they're products of this radically Islamized educational system that the US and Britain have been supporting. Well, you now have, coming back to WikiLeaks, the ambassador, who does support US policies, not criticizing them, Ann Patterson, she is regularly pointing out to Washington that U.S. policies in Afghanistan and Pakistan are contributing to radicalizing and dismantling Pakistan. Drone attack. The country is extremely anti-American by now, just overwhelming. Drone attacks, pressures on the military to go into the tribal areas, which they've always left alone. And all these things are contributing to possible splintering in the military system, radicalizing the population, and increasing the probability, as she points out, that among the tens of thousands of people involved in the nuclear weapons system, many of them, kind of like those lawyers, products of a radical Islamized educational system, they may be able to get their hands on fissile materials, have them leaked, and that's not impossible. And it gives you the ultimate nightmare, a jihadi bomb going off in London or New York. Well, that's what we're contributing to by the policies that are now being undertaken. There's plenty of evidence about this without WikiLeaks. But what the WikiLeaks tells us is that the planners in Washington and London are being informed of this directly by their own ambassador. I assume the same would be true in London, and they're going ahead with the policies. They're saying, well, it's kind of like these institutional necessities I was describing. You have a potential catastrophe on your hands, and so let's march forward and advance it. That's one revelation of WikiLeaks. That's a good thing for people to know. They ought to know more about it. And there are quite a number of other things like that. I could run through them if there's time. But although most of it is pretty pallid, actually, what ambassadors, what diplomats tell the Home Office isn't usually very interesting. But there's jewels in there that are worth looking at and that are quite revealing. There's no sense at all in which it damages world relations. I mean, it may embarrass some diplomats, but who cares about that? They should plenty of things for them to be embarrassed about, so they'll have a few more. But basically, I think it's a good thing. I mean, I don't think that Assange should be regarded as a hero. He's certainly not a villain. I think he should be considered as somebody who's doing a civic duty, helping the people in a formal democracy learn something about what the representatives are up to. And in fact, there's one comment on declassified documents. I've spent a lot of my time in my life going through secret documents that are declassified by governments, or in the case of the Pentagon Papers, stolen and so on, mostly U.S., but also British. And one thing that comes out very clearly, I think anyone who's studied these documents will draw this conclusion, is that although they're secret on grounds of security, the security is the security of the state against its own citizens. They rarely have to do with any real issue of security, defense of the country or something like that. They have to do with keeping the population uninformed about what their leaders are up to. And there are pretty good reasons for that. That's the way power systems in general are going to operate, and this is one of them. But going back to WikiLeaks, I think, that's the kind of thing that ought to happen. And you could see by the harshness of the punishment how seriously the government's taking it. Assange you're familiar with, but the more striking case is Bradley Manning, the American soldier who's accused, rightly or wrongly, of having given the original leaked documents to the WikiLeaks organization. He's undergone 7 months of torture, literally. He's been in he has no charge yet, but he's been in solitary confinement for 7 months. Solitary confinement is torture. Most people can't survive more than a couple of days of it. Why is he being tortured? Well, it's a warning to others. Don't give away our secrets. We want to be protected from our populations. I think these people merit a lot of support, a lot more than they're getting.
Thanks for that. I was an immediate convert to WikiLeaks when I had an email to say, "You're in WikiLeaks." And I was in WikiLeaks for my ambition on climate change. So clearly it was worrying the US officials who actually recorded that Wales was interested in playing on a global stage on climate change issues. But can I move on to our next questions from the audience, from Sue Essex?
Thanks, Jane. Well, actually, this question follows on very much from your last comment, because my question to Noam is it possible for a small country such as Wales to show leadership or have influence over critical international issues?
The answer is right here. That's showing leadership on critical international issues and having an impact, enough of an impact to worry the U.S. government. That's good. Yeah, of course it is. It could be an inspiration. It can be a model. It can construct initiatives that the big powers, for one or another reason, are too ossified or lethargic or bureaucratic to carry out. Yeah, a lot of things can be done. On climate change, dramatically, in fact.
Thank you. The next question is from Rita Toivanen. Rita, where are you? Please.
Good evening. The Arab world is currently in revolt, and it's not driven by religion. What is your opinion on what the implications of the situation will be for autocratic regimes worldwide?
Well, you're quite right that it's not driven by religion, and that's very important. This revolt that's taking place, the uprising all through the Arab world, is quite a spectacular development. I can't really think of any comparable one, at least in my lifetime. It just kind of hit the public arena now, but it's worth remembering that it's been going on for some time. So take Egypt, which is the most important case because of its significance in the region and so on. Those of you who've been following it know that the January 25th movement, the uprising, was organized by a pretty small group of young people, tech-savvy young people who really didn't expect anything like this. They decided to try to organize some small demonstrations, and it kind of blew up. They have a name. They're called the April 6th movement. Why April 6th? Because on April 6th, 2008, the workers in the biggest industrial installation in Egypt, the Mahala textile complex, were planning a major strike to protest against awful working conditions under the dictatorship, and planning also solidarity demonstrations along with it. Well, that was crushed by force, April 6, 2008. And that's the name that they picked because that means something in Egypt. What it means is there's been a long series of struggles against the dictatorship. It's no surprise. They don't get reported much, but they're going on. A lot of them get crushed by force, and they're supported by the great powers, US and Britain particularly. So take this one. This is April 6, 2008. Not long after that, Barack Obama made his famous trip to Cairo to show how much he loves the Muslim world. On his way, he was asked in a press conference, I think maybe by a BBC reporter, whether he was going to have anything to say about the authoritarian Mubarak regime, which is a bit of an understatement. It's one of the harshest dictatorships around. His answer was interesting. He said, I don't like to use labels for folks. Now, when a political figure uses the word folks, you kind of get ready for the lie or horrible statement that's going to come out. Otherwise, you talk about people. But when you talk about folks, you're preparing the ground. So he doesn't like to use labels for folks. He said, Mubarak's a good man. He's keeping stability, which technical term that means obeying orders. He's keeping stability. He's doing good things. He's a good ally. I have no criticism to make. Well, you know, Egyptian workers who've just been through this last crushing of a major strike and plenty of others, they could hear that. They could draw their own conclusions. The same with actually Tony Blair, who seems to have a genius for making the most outrageous statement at the wrong moment. He came out with a very similar statement right in the middle of the uprising about Mubarak. You may have seen it. But this was before. And what all this indicates is that there's been a lot going on, not just in Egypt or in Tunisia. It's all over the region. And it's been going on for a long time. People don't like to live under dictatorships, harsh, brutal dictatorships, with torture and violation of rights and suppression of speech and so on. It can be below the surface for a long time, but it can come out. And what these events show us is it can come out very significantly. And it's quite striking to see the reaction of the great powers, United States and Europe mainly. This happens over and over again, incidentally. Over and over again, there are cases where it becomes impossible to sustain your favorite dictator. And there's a game plan that's followed routinely. Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Chun in South Korea, Suharto in Indonesia. I mean, it happens all the time. Sustain them as long as possible. When it becomes impossible, either the army's turned against them or the business world turns against them, and popular uproars too much, or whatever. If you can't sustain them any longer, send them out to pasture somewhere. Issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy and of the people and rights and so on, and then try to restore the old regime. And that's the game plan that's being followed here. Try to restore the old system with new names. Nothing new about it. I mean, it's the kind of thing you ought to learn in elementary school. It's happened maybe a dozen times in the last 30 years, and many times before that. It's a little bigger this time, but notice the way they're doing it. In the case of Egypt and Tunisia, the first two cases, there has been no regime change. There's been a change of names, which is significant. And there's been some softening of repressive structures, also significant. There's been a freeing up of the press, which is very important. Labor rights are being improved because working people are just proceeding to take over factories and run them themselves. That's significant. But the basic structure of domination and control has not materially changed, and the US and Europe are trying to sustain it. It's worth bearing in mind, and here WikiLeaks again is interesting, that the US and Europe cannot support democracy in the region. There's a very simple reason for that, elementary reason, should be in the headlines. It has to do with Arab public opinion. In a democracy, if it's really functioning, public opinion is going to influence policy. So what's public opinion? Well, it's known. It doesn't get reported, but it's known. There's the leading polling agencies in the United States do studies of Arab public opinion. They're released by major institutions, Brookings Institute and so on. Planners certainly know them, even if they don't read them in the newspapers. Just to tell you what's in the newspapers about this, in the United States, nothing. In England, I think one article by Jonathan Steele in the Guardian. Actually, I asked him a couple of days ago if anyone else had ever written about it, and he didn't know anything. But that was the one report I saw of the latest poll results, which are quite striking. What they show is that in the Arab world, an overwhelming majority of the population regard the major threats to them as the United States and Israel. Britain's not important enough to be regarded as a major threat, but if they paid attention, they'd have added that. So it's the United States and Israel are the major threats. One of the questions is, do you think Iran is a threat? And some do, 10%. opposition to U.S. policy is so extreme that a considerable majority think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, it's 80%. 90% think the U.S. is the major threat. And the rest goes on like this. Under those circumstances, the Western powers are not going to be able to tolerate, they're going to do anything they can to prevent democracy. If a democratic uprising succeeded, the U.S. and Britain and France and the rest of them would be out. And that's a big change in world affairs. Control over Middle East oil, the major issue, has been a kind of like an axiom of the world control since the oil age began, way back to the First World War. So they're going to do anything they can to stop democracy from going too far, and you can see how it's being done. In Tunisia and Egypt, they're trying to keep the lid on. The serious places are places like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the jewel in the crown. That's where all the oil is. Saudi Arabia is the most extreme radical Islamist government in the world. It's also the center of jihadism, the funder of jihadism and so on. That's where the men on the planes that hit the Twin Towers were from. And it's been the leading ally of Britain and the United States for decades, ever since it was formed in the 1930s. Of course, it has most of the oil. The U.S. and Britain have been the major supporters of radical Islam, all the way through, for good reason, narrow reasons, but good ones. It's a barrier against independent nationalism. And that's what really worries them. The questioner pointed out that these uprisings are not based on religion. That's the frightening part. If they're a secular nationalist development, which might move towards independence, taking over your own resources, using them for your own needs, that's the threat, always has been. That's why the U.S. and Britain have supported radical Islamism from way back and still do. Anyway, if Saudi Arabia is threatened, then they got a real problem on their hands. I don't know what, today there was supposed to be demonstrations in Saudi Arabia. I haven't seen whether anything happened, but the police the security forces are all over the place. A very heavy police presence. Yesterday they were already using live fire. The ruling clerics have issued all sorts of declarations about how it's a major crime to demonstrate. Bahrain is particularly sensitive. By the standards of the region, it's relatively free, but pretty repressive. It's a Sunni kingdom with a majority Shiite population, and more significant, it's 30 kilometers away from eastern Saudi Arabia, where the majority of the population is Shiite, repressed, brutalized, and that's where most of the oil is. So you have a situation that's kind of like an odd historical and geographical accident took place. The oil resources of the region are right around the northern part of the Gulf, which are mostly Shiite areas, and the dictators are all Sunni. That's very explosive, and there's been concerns about that for years. If the Bahraini uprising infects, as they put it, eastern Saudi Arabia, then they're really in trouble. And they've been the U.S. And Europe have not even have been holding, don't even rhetorically support the demonstrators there. It's much too dangerous. Well, those are all things that are on their way. Will it influence autocratic regimes elsewhere? I think they're all trembling. What they're all seeing is you can't be sure you can keep the lid on. We can try, but these things are infectious. People see someone doing something somewhere, and say we can do it too. And the whole system of what's called global order, suppression of populations by authoritarian or worse regimes is in serious danger, including the whole imperial system and its residue. So yeah, these are major events. I don't think there's been anything like them. How far they'll go, who knows? But it is certainly, even if they're defeated, which could happen, there's certain to be a legacy. There are gains already, and they're not going to be beaten back. And it sort of gives a plateau from which the next struggle will take place. So I think we're in the midst of serious historical transformations.
The next question is relating to language. So is David Jones anywhere near a microphone?
Thank you, Minister. Professor Chomsky, perhaps to follow on from the last question to some extent, I'd like to pose or to pursue the question whether you consider language itself to be either the perfect or the imperfect instrument of empire.
Language is it's kind of like asking, is a hammer an instrument of destruction or of construction? The hammer doesn't care. I mean, the hammer doesn't care whether you use it whether a torturer uses it to beat in somebody's head or whether a carpenter uses it to build a house. Hammer's happy either way. And language is the same thing. It's a neutral instrument. It certainly is used as a tool of empire and a tool of domination and control. There's endless numbers of examples. It can be used as a tool of liberation, and often is. So it's up to us, really, what it is. It's there, it has its options and capacities. We have a choice as to how to use it. People will use it for their own purposes, to dominate, to control, to repress, to liberate, to educate, to open up opportunities. But as far as the language is concerned, it's happy anyway.
Next from Jack Parker. Jack.
Hi. Politicians are generally elected for terms of just 4 or 5 years. How can any politician have a long-term view of affairs when their sights may be on winning the next election?
Well, that raises a question about what we think about the nature of real democracy. I mean, I think there's a presupposition here that should at least be questioned. The presupposition is that it's the politicians who should understand, have a long-term view of affairs. There's another way of looking at it, which is that the populace should have that long-term view. And the political figures should be just representatives of popular views and understanding, who are granted the authority, the short-term authority to implement the will of the population. So I think the real question we should ask, you're certainly right, if we have a system in which the population are supposed to be spectators and the political leaders are supposed to be the participants, the actors, then it's important for the political leadership to have a long-term view of affairs. But that's an assumption that we need not make. That is, incidentally, the standard assumption of democratic theory, that the population are supposed to be spectators, not participants. If you look at, maybe some of you have studied political theory, this is the way it works. In fact, it's advocated. So in progressive essays on democracy, theories of democracy, the basic conception, I'll quote from one of the leading figures, but it's unfair to quote a particular person because it's almost everywhere. Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the United States in the 20th century, a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, not on the right wing. He, a well-known democratic theorist, is highly praised, called Progressive Essays on Democracy. And he articulates the common view quite lucidly. In fact, what I just said was quoting from him. His view is that the public who he refers to as ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, have to be prevented from interfering with the serious work. They have to be diverted somehow. As he puts it, we, the real thinkers, deciders, we have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. They're supposed to be spectators, not participants, okay? This is from the, not the far left, but this is the left of the spectrum. You go over to the right, it's much harsher. And that's a standard view. It's the view, for example, of the framers of the American Constitution. It was, the most democratic system in the world, in many ways still is, but you go back and read, say, James Madison, the main framer, he was concerned about the danger of democracy, regarded as a threat because of what the people might do. Actually had a concrete example in mind. England was the model they were thinking of course. And he raised the question in the Constitutional Convention of what would happen if in England the vote were really free. Everyone was allowed to vote and everyone was in a position to not only cast a vote but to influence policy. He said, what will happen is that the majority of the population who are deprived and poor, they'll use their voting power to take away the property of the rich. They'll carry out what we would call land reform, break up the landed estates and give out property and so on. And that's obviously unfair. You can't do that. So therefore we have to somehow reduce democracy. And that's the way the American constitutional system is set up, and Britain even more so. But the powers, in those days, the executive, president, was supposed to be really an executive, just an administrator. Power was supposed to be in the Senate. And as Madison put it, the Senate is the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men, the men who have sympathy for property owners and their rights. And the rest have to be fragmented somehow so they don't interfere with the decisions of the Senate. The Senate in those days was not elected. It was picked by legislatures, which it was assumed would be under the control of property owners. No direct election of senators until the 20th century. The House of Representatives, which is more democratic, closer to the population, have very limited powers. And that was the reasoning. Actually, for those of you interested in political theory, there's an interesting history to this. Madison was repeating, probably unconsciously, a discussion that Aristotle had. The first great book on political theory is Aristotle's Politics. And Aristotle considers the various possible political systems. He doesn't like any of them, but he says the least bad is democracy. Of course, he's talking about Athens, not the United States. But the similarities are great. Athens was the most democratic place at the time, but it was a democracy of propertied men, no slaves, no women. The same was true of the United States. Women didn't get the vote until 1924, incidentally the same year they did in Afghanistan. Slaves, of course, no vote at all, and you had property qualifications. So it was a democracy of free propertied men. Aristotle posed the same problem. He said if we have democracy, the poor will use their voting power to take the property of the rich, unfair. He picked the opposite solution from Madison. Madison's solution was to reduce democracy. Aristotle's solution was to reduce inequality.
Yeah.
And he discussed what we would call welfare state measures to try to get everyone to be middle class. Then you wouldn't have this problem. But the problem remains. If you have a highly inegalitarian socioeconomic system, the majority of the population will be able to use their voting power to create a more equal distribution of resources, opportunities, and so on. And that's inconsistent with the rights, presumed rights of those who are rich and powerful. So democracies are not a good idea. That's why constantly get elite contempt for democracy. Actually, going back to WikiLeaks, the most is a very dramatic illustration of this. The leaks that got the most publicity, you know, big headlines, euphoric commentary, and so on, were the ones that where the newspaper reports and the columns and the commentators were very happy that the WikiLeaks showed that the Arabs support U.S. policy on Iran. Now, they were quoting Arab dictators, and if you remember Craig Murray's comment, that may or may not have been what the dictators said, but let's say it was what they said. The dictators did say Iran is a serious threat, we got to do something about it. So we're delighted, we're happy. What about Arab opinion? I've already told you what they say. They're in favor of Iran having nuclear weapons. But our contempt for democracy is so profound that it doesn't occur to anyone. Read the commentary. Literally didn't occur to anyone that if we're supported by the dictators, but the population is overwhelmingly opposed, that's fine, as long as the population is passive, quiescent, diverted, and so on. And it's a dramatic illustration of the democratic theory, which is just a deeply rooted elite conception. And I think that comes back to your question, which is a good question, but it is based on this presupposition that somehow the population have to be spectators, not participants. And I think that's a question. I mean, certainly not everybody can spend their day making, you know, the decisions, but the people who do ought to be responsible to the public. And the public ought to debate and form and want to implement the decisions and pick somebody to administer it. That would be a real democracy. We're far from that. But in the conditions we have, I think your point is right. Was it you? That people, whoever's making the decisions has to have a long view. I think it would be preferable if it was the general public that did, and move in that direction, I think would be a healthy one.
Before we came down, I was explaining to Noam that we had a historic yes vote last week in Wales, and that in our fledgling democracy, we had a 2-to-1 vote in further of more powers coming to the Welsh government to take decisions here in Wales. And what was particularly, I think, wonderful for those of us who are campaigning is that vote was as strongest in some of our poorest areas in Wales, who have been looking to the Assembly government for support over the last 12 years. But another aspect of that vote last week was that the campaign was conducted on email, by text, by Twitter, and by Facebook.